The series, as we all know, is an initiative to engage and interact with academicians and scholars on various topics of discussion in the contemporary society. So we have one such scholar with us today, and it is my great privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr.Jyothsna Belliappa, who will be heading today's talk on a qualitative study on the interplay of gender, community, and professional identities in the lives of Anglo-Indian women in teaching. Dr. Jyothsna is a researcher whose interest areas include gender, work, personal life, and the relationship between these elements and issues of identity and pedagogy in both primary and tertiary education. She has several publications to her name in journals like Economic and Political Weekly, International Journal of Anglo-Indian Studies, and Gender and Education. And her book, Gender, Class, and Reflexive Modernity in India, discusses gender and cultural specific consequences of modernity in neoliberal India through the exploration of women in the IT industry. So Dr. Jyothsna has taught at several universities like University of York in the UK, Asim Premji University in Bangalore, and currently teaches gender identity, qualitative research methods, and ethics at Srishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design, and Technology in Bangalore. So it's my great privilege to welcome her to initiate the talk. But before that, a few instructions for the participants of the meeting. Please ensure that all your mics are muted so that there are no disruptions or interruptions while the talk is going on. And once the talk has finished at 45 minutes, we'll be opening up the floor for questions, the question and answer session. You can either post your questions in the chat box, or you can hold on to it yourself and can ask Doctor at the end of the talk yourself. So once again, I welcome Dr. Jyothsna to initiate the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and I'm very grateful to Professor Rekha Papu and Professor Anu Joy, who I knew as a colleague at Asim Premji University, for inviting me here, and especially to Anu for her patience in arranging the talk. We had, many false starts. We thought we'll do it last year, and then finally ended up doing it this year. So thank you for being patient with me and persisting in inviting me. And I am very happy to share this particular research with all of you, particularly because you all are with the School of Education. And in the past, I have shared this research with colleagues in oral history, in women's studies, in Anglo-Indian studies. We have a group called the Anglo-Indian Studies Forum, and there's a journal that the forum brings out. So I've shared it in these forums. So this would probably be my first time sharing it exclusively with colleagues and friends in education studies, and with so many students, though I have sometimes shared it in the classroom, but with so many students in education studies. So I would really be interested in hearing your comments, your feedback, and if you have any questions. A couple of things I also need to say is that, like I said earlier, if the electricity goes, since I'm giving this from my home, it takes a few minutes for the generator to switch on, and there is a lag in the Wi-Fi. The other is that I currently am alone at home, and the doorbell might ring suddenly. These are the kinds of interruptions you have in your home. So unfortunately, I can't mute the doorbell because the Wi-Fi and the doorbell are connected in the same socket. So if there is such a thing, I'm afraid I'll have to keep all of you waiting for a few minutes. Just answer the door and tell the person I'm not available. That rarely happens. I rarely get unsolicited calls, but nevertheless. So those are the two things I just wanted to share. I also want to begin by acknowledging my colleague Sanchia D'Souza, who did this research with me. Sanchia comes from the history background. She's completing her PhD in the University of Toronto. And we began this research together, and subsequently Sanchia went on to do her PhD. But she's been very much a part of the interviews, about the initial conceptualizing of the research, and also with the initial analysis. So I want to acknowledge her. And I would like to acknowledge all the people that we interviewed as part of the study. As those of us who do qualitative research know, it takes a lot for somebody to trust you with their life story and and they do it with a limited introduction that you give of yourself, and that, or perhaps somebody, some mutual acquaintance or someone gives of you. And based on that, a lot of trust is reposed in the interviewer. So I just want to acknowledge that. Also, before I begin the talk, I have a question. Probably most of us who are faculty members here are slightly older age group. I won't presume how much, but in 40s or over, maybe some of us might be younger also. But the students are probably in their 20s, most of them. So I want to know how many people, you can just raise your hand and show how many people here, if there is somebody who does identify themselves as Anglo-Indian, or their parents, one of their parents is Anglo-Indian. If you would like to share that, please raise your hand and let me know. And also, if you have an Anglo-Indian friend or classmate, if you've had Anglo-Indian friends or classmate, you can also raise your hand. So I just know if you've had some person in your life who is an Anglo-Indian, or if you've had Anglo-Indian teachers, raise your hand. Okay, Professor Rekha has raised her hand.
That's a friend, actually.
No,
Yeah,
okay.
well,
Sorry?
a doctoral
Colleague.
friend, yeah.
Colleague, okay. All right, okay. Okay, I'm not surprised that the two people who raised their hand, I'll also raise my hand. I have had Anglo-Indian teachers. I've gone to a school which had Anglo-Indian teachers, and I had Anglo-Indian friends in school. Of course, through this research, also I have made friends with various Anglo-Indian women. Sanchia would always clarify when in the early stages of the research, people would say, because her last name is D'Souza, the interviewees would say, are you Anglo-Indian? And she would say, no, I am Goan. So there are these differences in identity that, she would be specific to acknowledge. But it's interesting that none of the students, raised their hand. And I think that is partly because of the history in how the community has seen increasing migration to other countries, Canada, UK, Australia, etc. And also, of course, there have been intermarriages with other communities. So the numbers have reduced considerably. And the government claims that there are only a few hundred people in India who are Anglo-Indians. The community itself claims that the numbers are more than that. But I think that this is an indication of the dwindling numbers of the community generally in the country, as well as in education, in the teaching profession. So possibly our research, when we started doing the research, we felt we have come a few years too late. I wish we had done this research 5 years ago. We already, that has very much, that hemorrhage of Anglo-Indians from the teaching profession is already very much evident. So that sort of tells me that perhaps it would be good to start with a little bit of historical information, particularly for the students, so that you have a little bit of background with which we can actually go into discussing the research and the findings of the research. And there is a lot of confusion about the origins of the community and who the Anglo-Indians are. And I have found that this confusion perhaps could also be attributed to the fact that the Anglo-Indian identity is contested within the community itself. This became particularly evident in our forums of Anglo-Indian studies, where we would have scholars working on research amongst the Anglo-Indian community, various aspects of research, historians or sociologists or anthropologists, but also community members, leaders of the community, and there would be some, arguments, differences of opinion as to who is an Anglo-Indian within the forum, which would also tell me that this is a contested identity. Also to look at the history behind Anglo-Indian women's employment and the contestations behind the identity provides us a context for understanding interviewees' accounts. The community that is a culturally distinct community. It is also distinct in terms of religion and linguistically distinct. And it emerged from domestic relationships between European colonizers and the Indians in the 18th century. So in the early years of colonialism, the soldiers of the East India Company used to be encouraged to marry with Indian women, and they were also given a cash incentive like a family pay in order to, have marry and have a family with an Indian woman. Some of you might have come across William Dalrymple's book White Mughals, where he discusses such relationships between the officers of the East India Company and noble women within various families across India in different parts of India. Over the course of the 19th century, you saw that racial boundaries began to harden, and this culminated, of course, in the First War of Indian Independence in 1857. And increasingly over the 19th century, these mixed race unions became stigmatized and a source of some embarrassment to the colonizers. After 1850s, we hardly see any such marriages taking place. But in this period, in this century, also the mixed race community that had emerged out of these unions, they were largely identified themselves as Christian. They adopted a very distinctive hybrid culture. I'm sure some of you who are interested in cooking would have come across, for instance, now there is a revival of Anglo-Indian cookbooks, where there is this, it's a very Western kind of recipes, but with a lot of Indian masalas. And using English as their primary language, there was a certain distinctiveness to this community. They also became increasingly endogamous. And although there were attempts to align their identity with the British ancestor, their position was very precarious within colonial India as they faced prejudices from both the British and from other Indian communities. Interestingly, there is in the Indian constitution, there's actually a definition of who it is to be Anglo-Indian, who is an Anglo-Indian. So an Anglo-Indian is somebody who has one European male progenitor. But they are otherwise Indian in terms of their race and ethnicity. They would be defined as Anglo-Indian. In the later part of the 19th century, in the 20th century, in Anglo-Indian men's education and employment also started becoming dependent on these shifting policies and priorities and the prejudices of the colonial government. So you would find that in the early stages, a European father would perhaps find some job, some employment for his sons in the East India Company. But over time, as more and more generations of Anglo-Indians emerged, and they lost that connection with the British ancestors, with the grandparents, great grandparents, whoever. Then they started these little communities emerged in, say, the railway towns, because a lot of Anglo-Indians found jobs in the railways, in the army, postal and telegraph services. A few of them joined the government service in lower level administrative positions. And most of them had very limited education, maybe at the most high school education. Which was also in the missionary schools that were coming up in the 19th century. So some of them who managed to finish high school and perhaps had a few years of higher education, they would find employment. I'm talking only about men up to now. They would find employment in the missionary schools, but there were a lot of European teachers already there, so the opportunities were limited. As a result of this precarity in Anglo-Indian men's employment, we found that by the early 20th century, Anglo-Indian women were entering employment. And this was at a time when women from other Indian communities were not so likely to enter into employment. Of course, I'm making a very broad generalizations. I'm sure that there are exceptions that historians can point towards. In the sort of 19th century, there might have been a few women who were already entering employment. There were some homes that were, homes that were to be found in places, as far flung as, Kalimpong and Chennai, which were for destitute Anglo-Indian children, for children who had been orphaned or who maybe they had been abandoned by the European father. So in these cases, perhaps even before the beginning of the 20th century, women were looking for employment, maybe as nannies or seamstresses and so on. But by the 20th century, women who had some schooling would train as nurses, stenographers, teachers. During the Second World War, a lot of Anglo-Indian women found positions in the Women's Auxiliary Service, which came up, where a lot of women provided administrative, secretarial services in the army. And then you had military nurses, and they were traveling to war zones outside of the Indian subcontinent. So Anglo-Indian women who served as military nurses in the Second World War, they would very creatively draw on their knowledge of English and the fact that they had been trained possibly by European nuns or by other, European teachers. So they had access to what they would define as a certain kind of westernized professionalism and their Christian identity. And so they would, take this cultural capital and they would identify themselves as British subjects who embodied this kind of professional identity. And they managed to find jobs which created some degree of economic security within that period, because the period of the war was very economically very uncertain for many. So this is kind of creative strategizing that we see on the part of Anglo-Indian women, which I will come back to again when I'm discussing my research. Now, if you look at the kind of speeches and writings of the Anglo-Indian leaders of the time, particularly Frank Anthony, who was the de facto leader, head of the community for almost, I think, much of the 20th century, you will see that the community views women's employment with a mixture of pride as well as some anxiety. So on the one hand, he is, in his writings, they have various newsletters and so on. He's exhorting women that he's acknowledging their war contribution. He's talking with great deal of pride about what they've done for the country and so on. But he's also exhorting them that you should not be tempted away from the security of your parental influence. You must be close to home. And there's some concern suggested that, now women are getting to mix with the soldiers from the Allied armies. They belong to various European countries, and there might be intermarriages, or even outside of marriage, there might be relationships with them. So this kind of, anxiety about women's sexuality and about somehow, keeping that within the influence of the community is evident. And you see this with a lot of historical studies. There have been historians such as Alison Blunt, Brent Otto, have drawn attention to the duality in the identities of Anglo-Indian women and the concern about their virtues. And Brent says that their bodies represent sites of transgression in a racially conscious, race-conscious, casteist and hierarchical society. And their sexuality is seen to threaten existing racial boundaries. The community itself, of course, is also an evidence of a time where racial boundaries were more porous. Professor Dolores Chu, a historian who is herself an Anglo-Indian woman, argues that Anglo-Indian women's identities combine exoticism with linguistic and cultural accessibility, making them attractive to both European and Indian men. Their liminal position between two races and cultures has often led to stereotypes of them being, being frivolous, flighty, and sexually available. And this is very much evident in popular culture and imagination. Those of us who are familiar with the 1970s Bollywood films will remember the typical example of the vamp being, somebody with a name like Susie or Mary or Julie or something like that, and she's wearing, a Western, maybe a Western dress, while the heroine is seen to be this extremely chaste, usually upper caste Hindu woman. So you see this again and again in popular culture. Now, if you look at more recent ethnographic research on the Anglo-Indian community, whether it's in Chennai, Professor Lionel Kaplan or Professor Sudarshana Sen in Kolkata, it suggests that this contradictory attitude to women's identities continues within the community, where on the one hand, Anglo-Indian men speak of their women with pride in their professional contribution and family loyalty, and their efforts in keeping up kinship ties and caring for the home, while on the other hand, they express concerns over intermarriages with other Indian communities. However, with all these concerns expressed externally and with all these stereotypes and prejudices, Anglo-Indian women have continued in paid employment in railway towns across the country, as well as in erstwhile colonial cities such as Bangalore, Kolkata, and Chennai. The history of Anglo-Indians in Bangalore schools, if we look at that, we see that the history of the community and the history of English medium schooling in Bangalore is closely connected. Bangalore, as you know, was part of the princely state of Mysore before independence, and the Wodeyars, who were the rulers of Mysore, they had allowed the British to establish a military cantonment in the eastern part of the city. So the cantonment was culturally and architecturally very different from the adjoining Bangalore city, the Pete. And I'm sure that you will have similar, differences that you can point to in Hyderabad as well. These architectural, cultural, and linguistic differences in different parts of the city. In the 19th century, along with garrisons of the British Army and other colonial administrators, a small Anglo-Indian population also emerged in the cantonment. And at this time, you also had Dakini-speaking Muslims and Tamil Christians and Hindus also migrating to Bangalore to seek employment with the British officials. So there was even now when you go to the cantonment, it's more likely that you will hear people speaking in Tamil or in Dakini and in English, of course, rather than in Kannada. So even after independence, when the Pete and the cantonment were merged into one administrative unit, this distinctiveness was evident, and the latter, the cantonment, retained its more westernized and cosmopolitan culture. During the period between, say, 1850s and the 1950s, a large number of private missionary schools were established in the cantonment. So you have St. Joseph's Boys' School, the Bishop Cotton's Boys' School and Girls' School. You have St. Francis Xavier School for girls. You have St. Germain's for boys. And all these schools followed a British curriculum and were affiliated with various Catholic and orders, and there were also some schools established by Protestant missionaries. After independence, you have a new set of schools coming in along with these religious minority institutions, and these schools are set up specifically by the Anglo-Indian community. So the most famous are the Frank Anthony schools, which are also in Delhi and Calcutta. And then you had smaller family trusts setting up schools. So you had this Tracy Memorial School or the Tunbridge School and so on. Now, Frank Anthony was particular about setting up these schools because he associated the promotion of English with the community's survival in independent India. And he also felt that these schools will create job opportunities for Anglo-Indian teachers, and they do offer subsidized education for the community. However, you have a large number of non-Anglo-Indian students also joining these schools and paying a higher fee. In the 1960s, till independence, till the 1960s, these schools followed the British curriculum. But in the 60s, the Anglo-Indian community set up what we call the ICSE board, the Council for Indian School Certificate Exams, which has a much higher standard of English than the Karnataka State Board. And all these minority institutions, whether they are religious minority institutions, that is, they are your so-called convent schools, or they are linguistic minority institutions, which is how the Anglo-Indian community set up its schools. They are all affiliated with the council. And since independence, these schools have become part of India's modernization project. Upwardly mobile Hindu and Muslim parents sought the English medium westernized education that these schools offered for their children. After Bangalore's emergence as India's software capital in the 1990s, a new set of schooling choices has come into the city. So now you have the so-called alternative schools, which are secular schools. So it could be, for instance, either your Krishnamurti Foundation schools or other schools which are modeled on the Krishnamurti Foundation's more child-centric kind of education. And you have the international schools which have the International Baccalaureate or A levels, affiliation to the Cambridge Board and so on. But the continuing value of the older minority schools can be seen in the long queues that you find outside them during the admission season. Our interviewees began their careers in these minority schools in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they continued their careers into the 21st century, and therefore they have experienced the changes in the city's schooling market, which I will mention later again. So I'm going to briefly kind of visit the literature on gender in the teaching profession, because I imagine that all of you are quite familiar with it. So I'll just sort of briefly visit that, because I think that's important also to contextualize the interviews. And much of this literature kind of points to the numerical preponderance of women in school teaching, the close intersection of gender with professional identity, the marginalization of teachers within education policy decisions and institutional practices. Professor Poonam Batra, Professor Nandini Manjrekar, Professor Vimla Ramchandran have all pointed to this in the Indian context, arguing that while you have new education policies which recognize the agency and the well-being of children, the teacher is often framed as a passive enactor of these new policies and reforms. In the international context, I'm sure you're all familiar with Sandra Aker, who claims that women are underrepresented in school management due to the demands of family life, career breaks during pregnancy and motherhood, the lack of female role models, and limited time for professional development. My former colleagues in Azim Premji University, Professor Indira Vijaysimhan and Indumati, have also done primary research on teachers' lives, and they have also pointed to these issues. Then there is, writing by Jackie Kirk that is very well known, where she has argued that female teachers become co-opted into nation building. She's arguing in the context of her research in Pakistan that their reproductive role as women is always aligned with their identity of teachers. And this view of teaching is also internalized by women teachers themselves, who will often allude to their maternal instincts while discussing their commitment to their profession. Professor Aisha Khurshid, again, having done her research in the context of Pakistan, argues that women's education and teaching careers enables only a limited empowerment in exchange for submitting to a further regulation of their identities and sexualities. Also, Professor Indira Vijaysimhan and Indumati's research, they did it both amongst government school teachers as well as private school teachers. And they found that while government school teachers, often mention the security and relatively comfortable income that their jobs offer, and therefore make, suggest that they will continue in their profession for the rest of their working lives, private school teachers who are paid much less tend to change or give up their jobs depending on changing life situations such as migration, marriage, or motherhood. So the remuneration and working conditions in private schools where majority of women teachers are employed are not attractive enough to retain teachers. I think this is important to keep in mind when we discuss the lives of Anglo-Indian teachers who are exclusively employed in private schools. In fact, government schools, they feel are not, they would not even consider teaching in a government school or seeking government employment, and they usually cite that they don't know Kannada, that they don't know Kannada as the reason why they don't seek that kind of employment, even say in a central school or so on. But I believe that it is more than that. That is definitely a fact that they don't speak Indian languages very well. In fact, that comes up again and again in other research on Anglo-Indians and education of Anglo-Indians. But there's more than that. There is a certain sense of being comfortable in a certain environment. And I think that will become evident as we go into the discussion of the findings. So this is a small-scale qualitative research project, which is based on semi-structured interviews with women in the Anglo-Indian community who are teachers and who have spent the larger part of their careers in Bangalore. I also interviewed women who, men and women who are not Anglo-Indian, non-Anglo-Indian educators, including school principals and teacher trainers, and members of the Anglo-Indian community who are, might not be in school teaching, but who probably had family members in school teaching, so that you get a wider picture of the school teaching profession and the Anglo-Indian community. A snowballing method was used to find interviewees, drawing on first-person contacts, on interviewees' networks, and so on. And we found that in the early stages, when we tried to approach schools and school principals, we got a limited welcome, I would say. A couple of principals who wanted to, introduce us to their teachers, but there was a lot of concern that was expressed about the research and how the Anglo-Indian community would be represented. And this concern, as over time, I've grown to see how vulnerable the community feels. So it is very natural that that concern would come up. Anyway, just coming back to I've written in more detail about, Sanchia and I have an article about this whole question of research relationships and the positionality of the researcher and so on. I could share more about that with you. There's also an article in the Economic and Political Weekly from this particular research, but I won't go into how I framed that article, because if you're interested, you could always read it. That looks more at this whole question of cultural, social, and emotional capital, which is a term that Diane Ray uses and to take forward Bourdieu's theory. So we can talk a little about it when we have our interaction. But as I said, there's little point in my repeating what is in that article. So we had these semi-structured, what we call the life story interviewing technique, which comes from oral history. And usually life story interviews are guided by a sense of temporality. So I took this decision because of this reason, and then this resulted in this. And therefore, it had this kind of an impact on my profession or on my personal life. As was mentioned as Ruth mentioned in the introduction, I tend to look at women's careers and professional lives, but you can never look at a professional life without looking at personal life and the person's sense of identity. So these things are deeply interlinked. So I would find even in the interview, people would never talk about their professional life as it is distinct from the rest of their lives. And we've used pseudonyms and followed principles of confidentiality in the way in which we present the accounts from our research. It's interesting that almost everybody that we approached, the individual teachers themselves, while I said that principals were a little reluctant to introduce us, there were community leaders who asked us, why are we doing this and how we will present the community. Very, very valid questions. But when we approach teachers themselves, the reluctance was more on the lines of what can I tell you? I just do my day-to-day work as a teacher. What can a teacher contribute to some research? Research is seen as something with capital letters. So teachers would take a little convincing, but when they actually engaged in the interview, it was always a very lively conversation. And if you look at the transcripts, there are, we just ask one question or mention one thing that we would like to talk about, and you have reams of response from the person. That's how we found that there was extreme sort of engagement with the research, and in some cases teachers also read our the initial papers, the first drafts of the papers that came out of it, and commented on it, and they wished us well for conferences. And I'm really sort of very touched by the way in which I won't say all interviewees, of course interviewees have more interesting lives than our research, so not everybody was engaged, but a few of our interviewees have remained engaged with the research. So I'll come now, I think, to the discussion, the meat of the paper, the actual discussion of findings. And for one thing that we found is that as we spoke to teachers, even though, as I said earlier, that when I asked about who has had Anglo-Indian teachers or Anglo-Indian friends, none of the students raised their hand. So of course there is, a kind of a hemorrhage, I would say, of the community from this profession. But having said that, there is, when you talk to school principals or you talk to teacher trainers, they will always say, "Oh, I wish I could have more Anglo-Indian teachers." And there's one of our interviewees, Sandra, she had a 20-year career as a school teacher, and then she decided to get into teacher training, and she has her own agency for teacher training. She frequently gets calls from principals saying, "We want Anglo-Indian teachers. I don't mind if the teacher is trained or not trained, but she must be an Anglo-Indian." So she was saying, "I wish I had a tree that I could shake and all the Anglo-Indian teachers would fall out of it." So this thing of English, and when I asked her why, what is it that makes an Anglo-Indian teacher so valuable? Two things usually come out. I mean, this not only came from her, but from others. One is, of course, echoing and Frank Anthony's point that English is their mother tongue, and so they can teach English to other communities in India. And by teaching English to other communities, Anglo-Indians can overcome some of their social marginalization and thereby relate on terms of relative equality with majority communities and also participate in nation building. And that was Frank Anthony's, his recommendation and his vision, and that is echoed by the Anglo-Indian teachers. But there is also this thing of when you have Anglo-Indian teachers, there is belief that there is a certain kind of a work ethic that they bring to their profession, and that comes up again and again, and I'll come back to that. So there is when you talk to the teachers who are in their late 60s, 70s, and I think the oldest teacher we spoke to at the time was 78, they will always talk very nostalgically about the 1970s when you had parents from other communities. In the cantonment, as I said, you have a large Hindu, Muslim, and Christian population because you had these different communities there. They would always come and say that, no matter what you do, please teach my child English and socialize, expect that the children will be socialized into some sort of Western customs and manners. So unlike present day parents, they always said, well, present day parents don't have much respect for teachers, but those parents of the 70s, they showed complete faith in my teaching and do whatever is necessary, just give my child a good education. So there was this belief that having gone to this English medium school and not just learned to speak English fluently and with the right diction and so on, but also having been socialized into a certain kind of a westernized identity, the children will then have access to jobs and lifestyle that perhaps the parents did not have access to. Also, at the time, education in primary schools was not as child-centric as it is today. Corporal punishment was acceptable, and the teacher was believed to be right, no matter whatever methods she used. So you find that nowadays teachers feel that the child-centric methods that are now in vogue have disempowered teachers and eroded the respect accorded to the profession. Interestingly, Professor Vimla Ramchandran has also found this in her work amongst government teachers. Now, most Anglo-Indian women would go into primary school teaching, and you found less women in high school. They were there, but probably in a lesser numbers, and more men came into high school teaching. So as primary school teachers, many interviewees would inculcate a certain kind of writing style, speech patterns. These are forms of cultural capital that will benefit students later in their lives as well. So even something as simple as correcting the pronunciation of certain words and styles of pronunciation which this child might have picked up at home. Like when you say banana, the word banana, you put stress on the right syllable. You don't say banana, which might be possibly more common for Kannadiga children to say banana, but then you say banana. So you're drilling certain kinds of ways of speaking, certain speech patterns, drilling the rules of grammar and pronunciation, and working with children's diction. And that was seen as something that is very, very important. The other thing that I said is the kind of work ethic that is often associated with Anglo-Indian teachers. This idea of a high attentiveness to detail. So several of the non-Anglo-Indian teacher trainers and principals would say, I'm looking for Anglo-Indian teachers because they are very particular. And this word particular came up again and again from the non-Anglo-Indians. And if you talk to the teachers themselves, they will talk at very great length about the small details of their day-to-day work. Like when you're checking, marking students' work, which we commonly in India we call corrections, you check where they are putting the date, where they are doing the heading, how they are underlining things, how they've laid out their writing. And this kind of attention to detail is seen as very important when you are taking board exams, because there you have examiners marking hundreds of answer scripts in a matter of days. So it goes, it goes into how well the child is scores in the board exams. And this kind of attention to detail is seen to go beyond academic work. Like one principal who had himself been educated by Anglo-Indian teachers, and now he feels that it's unfortunate he cannot employ so many Anglo-Indians in the school. He said that they taught me the little graces of how to say please and thank you and how to wear your school uniform, which is lost over a period of time. And interestingly, there's a very interesting obituary that was written for one of the teachers. We did not interview her; she had passed away. But in that obituary, there's a lot of her old students have sort of written in to the person giving the obituary and told him exactly what kind of difference she made in his life. And they all talk about things like, I did not speak English at home, so she taught me English. She would get the children to come to her desk and sort of recite whatever she had taught, maybe a poem or something that she had taught the previous day. And as the child was reciting it, she had a needle and thread in a big box of buttons. And she would, if there was a button missing on the uniform, she would sew that button back onto the uniform, or she would say, well, tie your shoelaces or something like that. So this was seen as very important kind of things to learn, to inculcate for the job market later on. And I would argue that in Bangalore's emergence as a software capital in the 1990s, and this idea that Indian engineers speaking good English, and not just engineers, but the software industry recruited people in every capacity. A lot of the people that generation of the 90s that went into these multinational software companies, a lot of them had emerged from the English medium schools of Bangalore. So we don't quite recognize the contribution that these teachers have made in this area. You can see that there's again this creatively sort of drawing on their cultural capital, their Anglophonic identities, knowledge of Western music or art to build a career is something that you see, that same creativity and initiative that I had mentioned in the context of Anglo-Indian nurses can be found in the lives of our interviewees. And over a period of time, as other communities in Bangalore have learned to speak English and have also found access to these forms of cultural capital, the Anglo-Indians don't have exclusive hold over it. So you find that over a period of time, that the larger number of teachers that now teach English, for example, in these schools are non-Anglo-Indians. Perhaps they belong to other Christian communities, or they might be non-Christian teachers as well. But you also find that young Anglo-Indians are going into the more lucrative kind of jobs that are available in the globalizing economy. And some of the older teachers have shared that they try to encourage their daughters to get into the profession, but with little interest on the part of the daughters. In terms of the choice of profession, as the teachers, when you ask them why did you choose to get into the teaching profession, you find that many Anglo-Indian families could not afford a university education. So at the age of 16 or 17, when they finished schools, there were very few choices open to them. One was to train as stenographers and get into office work. But at such a young age, the parents were hesitant to send their daughters to work amongst men. So the other option available to teachers is to get the teacher training certificate, which is offered by the church. You have a teacher training offered in Bangalore and in Chennai. And this is a 2-year certificate that is offered at subsidized fees, and you are trained to teach up to the 6th or 7th standard. So, as I said earlier, the government school employment is not available, and that also would have required them to have a BA degree and a BEd. So, after this teacher training certificate, teachers used to usually go to members of the community, or the parents would approach other members of the community, church leaders, community leaders, and say, can you find my daughter a job? In some cases, they would even go back to the same school where they had studied and start working over there. And so when first jobs are obtained via family, friends, and church leaders, you can begin your career in a relatively safe and familiar environment. But it also means that it is difficult to negotiate the terms and conditions of work. So whatever salary is given and is accepted. And this difficulty in negotiating with the school management or the school board continues for much of their career, because the job is obtained based on this kind of social capital and networks within the community. Even though, on the other hand, you look at the career narratives of individual teachers, you'll find that many of them have shown a lot of agency for a 16 or 17-year-old girl. Moved out of your hometown. In some cases, they wrote to friends and family in other cities and said, can you help me find a job, and so on. But it is still within the constraints of the community network. Also, there is a tremendous pride and a tremendous emphasis on earning an income and contributing to the family. So teachers will say, when my father was employed, but we had a large family, I had several younger siblings, and even if I got 150 rupees as a teacher's assistant in the 1970s, that was a very big amount, and that made a lot of difference to my family. So they would send money home, they contribute to their parents. Before marriage, after marriage, of course, they contribute to the family that they are creating. There's a lot of money spent on their own children's education, or teachers will obtain admission for their children within the school where they are teaching, because then the child can get free education. So there's a tremendous kind of emphasis on contributing to the family. And there's a lot of a sense of accomplishment and pride in that identity as a self-reliant woman. If we compare this with research that has into women's careers in the especially middle-class women's careers in upper caste, say Hindu families, and I found this in my own research with women employed in the IT industry, women often downplay their financial contribution to the family income, perhaps to preserve some kind of, the traditional patriarchal authority structures that exist in the family. So even if they are making quite a strong contribution to the family income, they avoid drawing attention to that. But in this case, in the case of our Anglo-Indian interviewees, people are completely open about the fact that their earnings are very, very important to the family. Perhaps because historically, Anglo-Indian women have been earning for now over a century, right? They've been in paid employment of one sort or another for a very long time. Having said that, as I said earlier, negotiating the terms of employment, negotiating salaries is very, very difficult, because you people find it extremely hard to negotiate with a school board member who might also be a family friend, who you might see in church on Sunday and so on. So the only way to get into a slightly higher wage bracket is once you have been teaching for a few years to take a BA and BEd degree by a correspondence course. And this is done while managing family responsibilities and work and so on. And often teachers will say that whatever salary was given to us by the principal, we took it. We didn't ask for more. And usually they would cite that perhaps the principal thought we had our husbands as a backup, and this assumption that women's earnings are, women's earnings are sort of supplementary income. That is the patriarchal assumption that is made within by the school management. Having said that, I mean, the fact that most of our interviewees, about 11 of our interviewees were over 60 years of age, and 9 of them are still working, either part-time or full-time, or they are tutoring children at home. So it's an indication that they are still, even in their 60s, in quite a precarious financial situation. I mean, retirement is not an option. And one needs to understand this as a consequence of their linguistic and religious minority position. Private schools, these minority institutions, although the council suggests and recommends that they need to follow similar pattern to the pay commissions that of the government, but they don't have, the council does not have the means to actually monitor this implementation of the pay commission within the schools. So the teachers are very much dependent on the management's gendered assumptions about what is appropriate pay, about pensions, allowances, etc. Of late, a few schools have started publishing pay scales related to educational qualifications and experience. And so that has made some difference. At least there is transparency about how much the teacher is paid. Also, private schools discourage unionization, but you will find that teachers, relationships within the staff room are very, very strong. And there's a lot of informal support for each other. So during illness or when people have accidents or things like that, there's always this tendency for the teachers to come together and support each other. I'm realizing that I've come to the end of my 40 minutes. So I'll wrap up quickly. So you find that although, there is, in many cases, the management will not offer sick leave or offer, any kind of support with illness, but you find that teachers will get together. In one case, one teacher cited that when she had cancer, her colleagues took out a bank loan collectively to help her finance her treatment. There's a lot of emotional and practical support from other teachers. And there is a lot of pride taken in the relationships that teachers have with their students. So they will often talk about the affection and of students who graduated from the school and so on. So coming to this is, I think, one of the most strongest sources. The fact that students write back and students keep in touch is one of the strongest sources of pride and satisfaction of the teachers. Another thing that I talk about relationships with management. One thing very interesting thing I would like to draw on is this idea of how teachers should dress. So in the 70s and 80s, there was, in certain schools, particularly the Anglo-Indian schools, there was a lot of emphasis that Anglo-Indian teachers must only wear Western dresses and skirts to school to underscore their identity. And the school management actually required the headmistress to monitor the length and the fit of the teachers' clothes. But many younger teachers found this dress code impractical, and they prefer to wear shalwar kameez or trousers. One is because a lot of women in Bangalore ride two-wheelers, so it's more convenient. But also in order to blend in, because they felt that they might be harassed in the in the public space, and that this harassment increases if you are identified as a minority woman. So it took a very long time for the teachers to actually negotiate a more flexible dress code. with the management. But that's one, that is an interesting example of how the patriarchy tries to encode the community identity on the bodies of women. There's also increasingly been a surveillance of teachers' work and greater regulation by both management and parents, and some simultaneous de-skilling of teachers across India. This has been researched by Professor Nandini Manjrekar. And in private schools, there are often trainers who come in to train teachers, and some of them don't have any experience of the classroom, right? But they are hired to professionalize teachers. So some interviewees cited these trainers coming in and suggesting techniques that have little relevance to the realities of the classroom. My final sort of point, which I would like to make, is about religiosity. We found that there's a strong sense of religiosity within the community and amongst teachers, and they will often, draw on a religious explanation for whatever happens in their lives. They will say, God wanted me to be there in that particular school, or if I lost my job, that was God's will. Maybe He had other kinds of plans for me, and this terminology of a talent, right? I have a talent, and therefore I need to employ it in the service of others. What is the use of keeping a talent to yourself? You must serve other people. This terminology of talent is also found in the Bible, that you invest your talents for the sake of the greater good. And there is a deep kind of a deep emphasis on the idea of vocation rather than profession, that you take your teaching as a vocation, and you're motivated by a higher purpose, and a purpose that is dictated by a Christian ethic of service or by love of children. And so you must draw on the gifts that you have in order to serve the children in your school. This sometimes actually erodes even to position this as a gift, teaching as a gift, natural gift or a talent, sometimes erodes the value of the training and qualifications that are involved in becoming a teacher. But having said that, there is always this talk of teaching as a calling or as a vocation. Now, I don't think this is only exclusive to Anglo-Indian teachers. I think teachers from other communities might also express their commitment to their profession as a sense of calling. But here it is very much drawn, as I said, from a Christian worldview. And therefore, when teaching abilities seem to be a natural or inborn talent, it can devalue the teacher's efforts in pre-service or in-service training. So their sense of dedication itself as teachers, I think, makes them vulnerable to exploitation. But on the other hand, religiosity also helps teachers cope emotionally with the demands of their job. So it has, I think, Christian faith, the strong faith of the teachers, has a complex consequence, because it can engender resignation to an unhappy situation or to an unjust situation, but it can also strengthen them to meet professional and personal challenges. So it can be both empowering because it helps the interviewee to be resilient in the face of injustice and to create a sense of higher purpose in professional life, and elevates the mundane duties of the classroom to a mission that serves a higher purpose. So in conclusion, what sort of conclusions could we draw from these accounts? I would say one is to, like I said earlier, that Anglo-Indian women are, I think, extremely creative in the way they strategize and draw on their community identity and create their teaching careers, and they kind of find a way to make the best use of their limited cultural and social capital. And also, like I mentioned earlier, because they occupy this somewhat liminal and vulnerable space within Indian society as a racial minority and a religious minority, they are also able to create a position which is associated with respect and gain a degree of respectability within Indian society. This respectability also, this respect is also, I would say it's there, but it doesn't quite take away the vulnerability of their position. So I think I think I need to make a nuanced point over there. But importantly, it's it allows them to overcome some of the social marginalization that is associated with their identities. And although they are reluctant, with some exceptions, they are reluctant to challenge the authority of community leaders and of their school principals and so on, which again points to their vulnerability as minority women. They are able to strategize and to draw on each other to create a support system amongst themselves. It can be argued, I would say, in conclusion, that there are complex and intersecting patriarchies at the level of community, region, nation, as well as the school. And these patriarchies are being, we would say, in the contemporary period, are being threatened by an increasing majoritarianism, right? It's becoming increasingly threatening, these patriarchies, in contemporary India, which could make the situation of minority women even more precarious than before. But having said that, I would also argue that though we are in a precarious, we are increasingly getting into this very worrisome situation, and in fact we've been seeing this in Karnataka of late with the question of hijabs being worn in colleges and so on. I would argue that there is a strong sense of self-determination within the community, and especially amongst women of the community, which has been evidenced in all of our interviews. So I will stop there. And I'm happy to hear your comments and your feedback.
Thank you for sharing your research findings. It was fascinating overall. I have a couple of comments and queries, but I'll wait to see if others are. I think Ruth is still probably facilitating the discussion, since I don't know if she has issues. I just stepped in. So yeah, Jyothsna's presentation is now open for discussion, for questions.
Yes, ma'am. As Rekha ma'am mentioned, the floor is now open for questions. If the participants do have questions, please do raise your hands and speak in turn.
What I would like to do is hear, if there are multiple questions, maybe hear a few questions and then respond, if that's okay.
Okay,
Or,
okay, okay.
Yeah, comments, yeah.
Ramakrishna, would you like to begin?
Yeah, thank you for presenting, ma'am, a detailed insight. I never had this view actually. This was useful. Any research data that anywhere we can study? Any data that backs some of your observations?
You mean from the same research project, or?
Yeah. Yes, I think since you alluded to some of the patterns with which there are changes or treatments, I'm trying to see what data is, any data trends of how many are still in the, in whatever.
In the profession. Okay, okay. All right.
If it is available, just to learn a little more.
Okay, okay. I'll respond to that. Maybe some others might have.
In terms of the factual aspects, Jyothsna, so the teacher training certification that you were referred to, is it recognized by NCT? Is there any kind of formal recognition, or this is informal. It's like the Montessori kind of the
It is,
many kinds of
as far as I know, it is like the Montessori, but there is, I'm not sure, to be frank, whether it's recognized by the NCT or not, but it is definitely recognized by the English medium schools, because that is where the teachers get get the jobs. Having said that, of late, there has been a lot, the council has been putting a lot of pressure on schools that all teachers need to be B.Ed trained, because the NCT would recognize a B.Ed. So you have a lot of teachers with even 20 years experience going to take a B.Ed in some local B.Ed college, where they go in once a week and give their attendance and study a few guidebooks and things like that, and complete their B.Ed. This is purely for the certification, and I think you all would also be aware that of late there's the other programs of the Indian government like Nishtha and so on have there's been a lot of pressure on schools to get teachers to do these certifications, and they will have to do it. I think you would know better than me, but it's not enough to do it once in your career. I understand you do it multiple times. So these kinds of certifications, they now need to get. But I teach schools also get around this sometimes by then employing the teacher as a so-called consultant. So that they are not seen to be on roles as full-time teachers. This also makes their position a little more precarious, because then as a consultant you don't need to get the other benefits like gratuity and PF and things like that. So it's a slightly murky area. It's not absolutely, it's a gray area. It's not absolutely clear. In terms of the data, I mean the data from this particular research, the qualitative data, is available in the various articles that we have published. International Journal of Anglo-Indian Studies. That is, it's not behind a paywall. It's an open access journal. So we have a couple of articles there. There's one in EPW. There's also this quite well. I mean, I think the first book was very well known. It was called Women's Words: The Feminist Practice of Oral History. It's an edited collection of oral histories from across the world. It was published in the early 1990s. 2018, there was another volume published called Beyond Women's Words. I'll put it in the chat as well. So in that, we have discussed what I had sort of indicated, some of the issues of research relationships and research ethics that come into play, sort of trying to contribute to this whole question of what happens within feminist interviewing, with the relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee. As I mentioned earlier, Sanchia herself belongs to a minority Christian community. Her last name, D'Souza, could be an Anglo-Indian last name, but it is not. I think for most people outside of the community, except if you are extremely aware, there is a tendency to conflate many Indian Christian groups' identities together. So you might not even separate out or distinguish between a Goan identity and an Anglo-Indian identity. But these kinds of distinctions are very important to Indian Christian communities, that these distinctions of, are you a Goan Anglo-Indian, are you a Goan Christian, are you an Anglo-Indian, are you a Tamil Christian? In Kerala itself, there are different churches and different communities associated with them. In fact, the Malayali Anglo-Indian group, you will find that there is a lot of contestation about their that community, and their presence within the larger Anglo-Indian community. So in terms of data, I don't know whether you are looking for actual numbers, numerical data. There is a lack of clarity about numbers because there has been no official census of the Anglo-Indian community. They only know of their numbers in terms of membership of the Anglo-Indian Association. And there also there is a breakaway group called the Anglo-Indian Guild. So that will tell you that, about the numerical strength of the community. But there also they refuse membership to women who have married outside the community. So if a woman marries a non-Anglo-Indian person, then she and her children don't have membership of the community. So I'm not sure, Ramakrishna, if you're alluding to that kind of data, or to the numbers of school teachers from the community, which might be another kind of data. I wasn't sure what exactly.
I think it was a broad question, and I'm looking at to understand the data source of the observation. So
Okay.
more on to understand the data
Okay,
on
then you're
the
looking for
scenarios that you quoted, and
right.
to understand your way of research on this. Because I'm also a student, I'm learning now how educational research has to happen. So trying to learn your pattern of, since it's a very delicate topic and very, I don't know, the risk of wrong choice of word. A topic that I haven't thought much, since it's a very specialized area. I was thinking some data trends will help.
Right. So from that point of view, and maybe I can tell you a little about the analysis. So generally with live story interviews, you have this analysis of the story itself, right? So each individual life story. So the person will say this happened, that resulted in this, then I took this decision that resulted in that. So to give you an example, for example, one of the opening questions of the interview would be, can you tell us a little about your schooling and your memories of your own school teachers in school? We would open with that question. And then that would lead us to childhood memories, their memories of schooling, and then into their teacher training, how they got into teacher training. And then subsequently what happened after that. So that is one way of analyzing the interview accounts, right? That you go look for the themes that emerge again and again within the same interview, right? So, for example, if they are, if within the same interview the person is constantly referring back to to a religious explanation for something, then religiosity is important to that person. At another level, we did what is more commonly done as grounded thematic analysis. So again, grounded within the accounts, what are the themes that are emerging across different interviews? What I presented to you today would be the latter, would be possibly grounded thematic analysis more than the account, what came out from individual accounts. But if you look at my articles which have come out in the Journal of Anglo-Indian Studies, there you will find examples of narrative analysis within one single account. In fact, we've presented 3 cases where we've done the narrative analysis within one single account. But I am careful, I think, to make broad generalizations because the community is so small and it is, as I said, it's a small scale research. We've not done more than 25 interviews. So it's still, I mean, of course, it's a small community in itself. So the universe from which we are, selecting the group of interviewees, the sample as we would call it, is small. And I would be careful to do a very, very kind of sweeping generalizations, but I would actually like to perhaps hear from some of the group what you picked up in the presentation. As I said, one of this thing of intersecting and multiple patriarchies which make minority women more vulnerable, and teachers are anyway occupy a vulnerable position in education. So that could be one strong conclusion that can be drawn. I probably will talk more, but I can see somebody else's hand raised.
There's another question now. Sir, Murli sir.
Yeah. Hi, Jyothsna. This is Murli. I teach at the school, Azim Premji School of Education here. First of all, thank you for delivering this talk. And also my apologies, my call was dropped in the middle because of power fluctuation. So I don't know if I missed something crucial. So therefore, you may find my question perhaps ignorant of what I missed. Pardon me for that, but let me go ahead and ask you this question. One question that I have actually two questions. So one question that I have is with regards to any kind of an account of development of these Anglo-Indian schools from the colonial period. So that is one question that I have. And the second question is in terms of gendering itself, right? When the schools, Anglo-Indian schools were started during the colonial period, who were the teachers then? And when did women become, prominent in these schools? This is, the second question that I have. If you already answered in the presentation, it's okay, I will watch the recording later, but otherwise you can just briefly mention.
Okay, thank you, Murli. No, I have not gone into that. So thank you for asking me this question. Like I said, if there are a couple of more questions, then I will just note them down and answer together.
So far,
I have a question.
Yes.
Actually, Jyothsna, it would be nice if you can elaborate on the inspiration for you as a researcher to choose this area as your study, why you were choosing Anglo-Indian teachers. And if you can elaborate a little bit more on how the newly emergent schools, like the way you mentioned the Jiddu Krishnamurti schools, or how those schools in Bangalore kind of approach to the Anglo-Indian community or teachers. I know in Kerala, like I raised my hand, I know Anglo-Indian, they are teachers, my teachers in the school where I studied. There were a couple of Anglo-Indian teachers, and in Kerala, they were very valued. And most of them were English teachers, in fact. How they are kind of integrating to the present education and their identity as a teacher in the progressive school of education. In fact, the terrain of education in Bangalore changed a lot. A lot of progressive schools started coming in Bangalore.
Right. So starting with Murli's question, development of Anglo-Indian schools from the colonial period. So I'll just distinguish because I think this is an important distinction that the schools themselves, try to make when you are talking to school principals or teachers or members of school boards and the community also, that there are religious minority institutions and there are linguistic minority institutions. So the religious minority institutions are our missionary schools, what we commonly call as convent schools. These were established in Bangalore, Chennai, Calcutta during the, maybe as early as the middle of the 19th century. I know the oldest school in Bangalore is Bishop Cotton School. I think that was established, if I recall correctly, in the 1840s or maybe early 1850s. I studied for some time in a school called Baldwin School in Bangalore, in my primary school. That was when I studied there, we celebrated the centenary in 1981, I think, 80 or 81. So that we celebrated, centenary celebrations of that school. So that means it was established in 1881. So these schools were established in order to for two reasons. One was to for the children of the British officials who were stationed in Bangalore. The army garrison was set up after the Anglo-Mysore War in East Bangalore. So I would say maybe I think 1799 was the setup. So after that, children of the British officials were sent to these schools. So for example, St. Joseph's School, which is very well known, very well respected old school in Bangalore, you had St. Joseph's European School and St. Joseph's Indian School later. So so there was a distinction in the admission to that school. So the other purpose of setting up these missionary schools was a more philanthropic, charitable kind of purpose of the mission, the religious mission that came to India. And they were mostly, like I said, they were mostly these religious orders of Catholic religious orders that set them up. In some cases, in a few cases, American missionaries, Protestant schools, were set up. Like Baldwin's school I went to was a Methodist school set up by American missionaries. Now, after independence, when there was a lot of talk about, actually in the period leading up to independence, there was a lot of talk within the community as to whether their interests were aligned with Britain or they were aligned with India, and then within the Anglo-Indian community. And Frank Anthony finally argued that our interests are aligned with India. There was even talk about setting up an Anglo-Indian nation in the Andamans and so on. So there was some talk about that, and that didn't go very far. And then it was decided that we will align ourselves with India, but we will maintain the Britishness of our identity, particularly with identifying with English, right? English language, but also this emphasis on teachers wearing Western dress. I mean, it's also a way of cueing that this is a more, westernized, anglicized atmosphere, and that there is a certain kind of westernized, if you like, a westernized identity that these teachers embody, and that these practices, these manners, westernized manners, along with English, is something that the students will be socialized into. So if you look at 60s, 70s, early 70s in Bangalore, a lot of these, the science institutions were there, a lot of these public sector companies were set up and so on. And of course, there was the local Kannadiga population, and all the children from these schools were sent from these families were sent either to, the convent schools, the religious minority schools, or the secular schools, the linguistic minority schools that the community set up. So Frank Anthony schools are set up as linguistic minority schools. And there were a few other Anglo-Indian families who also set up smaller schools in various parts of the cantonment, either primary schools or full primary and high school, maybe with less than 200, 300 children. But these were all set up as linguistic minority institutions. So they would, even though there was some, they would from time to time allude to, maybe in an assembly or in the teacher's conversation with the children, they might allude to some Christian values. There was no teaching from the Bible and things like that, because these were seen as secular schools. So they will allude to good morals, good values, and so on. But the religious minority institutions, for example, the Catholic children would go to catechism class, and the non-Catholic children, whether they were from other Christian communities or they were non-Christians, would go to a moral science class, while the Catholic children went to catechism. Right? So this was the thing in the independent India. And the idea was, like I said, to create a position for the community, saying that, okay, we have English as our first language, I know the term mother tongue is, my friends in linguistics, they, increasingly dissuade the term mother tongue. But this is our primary language, and we can teach it to other communities. Of course, like I said, over a period of time, there are English teachers from various communities, and it's not the exclusive preserve of the Anglo-Indian teacher. When did women start coming into these schools? Like I said earlier, initially with the religious minority institutions, you had a larger number of European teachers. After independence, when many of the European teachers went back to their home, most of them British, but when they went back to Britain, then you had opportunities in these schools available to Indians. Women coming into these schools, you would see more from the 50s onwards, but women teachers participating in education, but it may be in home tutoring, and going to the families who could afford it, wealthy families who could afford it, who would look for women to come home and tutor their daughters. You found that both European women as well as Anglo-Indian women and domiciled Europeans, that is, people who have maybe spent a couple of generations, though they're not Anglo-Indians, but they are a couple of generations of have lived in India, British families. So domiciled Europeans, women from these communities, they would go in and teach, in these kind of contexts, home tutoring. So you did have women's presence in education, Anglo-Indian women's presence in education in a small number before, but more, I would say, more of women getting into teaching from the 50s onwards. Before that, you do see women in nursing, a lot of women in nursing. And then they have also been in stenography and so on. Yeah, so that is my response.
Thank you, Jyothsna.
If there are no other questions, we have come to the end of the discussion today. Just one more request. Is there any other questions from anyone? Just inquiring.
Have I answered Anu's? I think I've not answered Anu's question about inspiration for me to do this research. And you said, how do they get into the newly? So let me answer the second question first. I found that it's interesting because, where many teachers expressed reluctance to get leave even if they expressed, that they were not, they felt that they were not paid very well. Many of them, there is also initially, I think till the 80s, there were some, times when they could supplement their income with giving tuitions at home. Though not all women are able to do it, because you also have your home responsibilities, your family responsibilities and childcare and all that. But some teachers would give tuitions at home, but then the school started discouraging it because parents began to suspect that perhaps the teaching in the school was not good enough, so that the children were forced to go to and take tuitions at the teacher's home. So that was, frowned upon. Even though, and then there were cases where teachers would try to find some other means of supplementary income, which was also precarious. But in spite of all that, there was a reluctance to leave the religious or missionary schools or to leave these Anglo-Indian schools, partly because you were amongst colleagues like yourself. So there was even conversations about how when I went to interview in the school, the principal told me when I take out my lunch box and there might be non-veg in my lunch box, the other teachers will not be uncomfortable with it. Right? I mean, that is interesting. Today, when there's so much of so much sensitivity around food, vegetarian and non-vegetarian food, you realize that teachers from minority communities or people from minority communities have been experiencing this discomfort. I mean, possibly not physical violence, but this discomfort around dietary practices, around the kind of food you're eating, whether you have beef in your lunchbox and all, such concerns are there for a long time. And like I said, that they don't choose to, seek employment in the government schools. They claiming that, yes, that I think not knowing Kannada is an important factor, but also this thing of I'll be in a context where people see my Western clothes or my, my Anglo-Indian identity in a way that might be unsafe for me, that there might be some kind of harassment that I face, or that I would be, they're very aware of the stereotypes that Anglo-Indian women face and the stereotypes in popular culture and so on. But so there is reluctance to leave these kinds of schools, or to leave even amongst the older teachers, to leave even the security of the cantonment Bangalore East and go beyond central Bangalore to other parts of the city. But having said that, those who make a few of them did make the leap from these missionary schools going into the newer schools, and those interviewees who did actually found that they're getting much better paid. They're getting a much better pay. They're appreciated. Their work ethic, their way of working is appreciated very much, and they are quite happy in the new schools. And also, numbers of students are much less in the newer schools. Of course, with the RT now there is some regulation of numbers, but in the 70s and 80s you could have up to 70 children in a classroom. So there's much that they find that actually they are much happier in the newer schooling system. And some of a couple of the teachers who got into teacher training, and when I say teacher training, it is not necessarily, it is their own sort of consultancy that they have opened. It's like they are self-employed teacher trainers, and they are doing training within the same kinds of schools where they have worked as teachers. But when they get requests from some of the teachers who are about to retire, saying that what will I do with the rest of my life, they encourage them to go and seek employment in these newly emergent schools, whether they are international schools or these more so in international schools, perhaps less in the Krishnamurti Foundation sort of school, because there you have to be socialized into the ideology of the KFI schools, which they might not be familiar with. As far as inspiration for me as a teacher is to do this, I was a school teacher before I did my PhD. I was a school teacher. I have had that experience of being a school teacher, of being the person who like I said earlier, was quoting Professor Nandini Manjrekar and Professor Poonam Batra, saying that the teacher becomes a somewhat passive recipient of all the decisions that are taken, policy decisions and so on, that are taken at a higher level, and she's becomes the conduit from which these reforms are implemented. So I know something of that that kind of position. That was in one part the inspiration, and I myself, I actually, I mean, I don't know whether this, this is a researcherly kind of story, but I was sitting in a class. So I went to an evening class on poetry appreciation, which was run by an Anglo-Indian lady in my neighborhood. And something that she said about the position of Anglo-Indian women and in society, and how they are looked at with a sort of salacious gaze. That, as well as my interest in teachers, kind of came together, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to study. But it has given me a much better understanding than I had before about what does it mean to be positioned as a minority within India. And I think in contemporary situation where there is so much of so much of vulnerability that minorities are facing in our country, this becomes particularly important. It's given me a better understanding of that. I mean, I belong to a linguistic and cultural minority myself. I'm from Coorg. I think my surname is makes that quite evident. But I'm not necessarily in a position of vulnerability as a woman from Kodwa Coorg minority. But nevertheless, it's given me more of a nuanced understanding of minorities. Of course, it's a work in progress. I still have to learn a lot about that.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for answering the questions. I think we have come. Rekha, ma'am, would you?
No, if you're ending it, that's fine. I mean, there would be some comments and questions. I think the discussion could continue.
I would love to
Yes,
hear
ma'am.
a couple of
Yes, ma'am.
comments from you if you don't mind.
I'm just wondering, Jyothsna, how do they, whether you asked them or whether they commented on how they related to the content of the textbooks, because they would probably not necessarily find themselves in it. You're also speaking of a previous time, which is unlike today, where nationalities are defined in a rigid manner. So perhaps it was a different kind of content that they were engaging with, but given that as English teachers, they would necessarily be working with narratives, with representations, whether that impinged on their own sense of themselves at any point.
Yes.
I recognize too that they are teaching, you were talking of teachers who are teaching at the primary level. So the textbooks would be varied and probably these schools adopted ones that, but I just wondered if they had anything to say about the content that they were using to teach the language.
So the ICSE textbooks actually from mine, there was no specific discussion of textbooks itself, but there was a lot of discussion of teaching and what happens in the classroom. So at the primary school level, you're teaching multiple subjects. Though you are, you're drawing on that knowledge of English, you're teaching multiple subjects in the primary school. The ICSE textbooks, as you know, they have, I mean, they used to be quite, I think, quite anglicized in content, especially the English textbook. You might have like one poem by Nizam Ezekiel or by Sarojini Naidu or something that, that sort of, or Tagore within the textbook. But there is also a lot of emphasis on, British writers and poets and so on. But over a period of time that has changed, where you have more diversity. So they will try to include something from every Commonwealth country, for example, in the high school textbooks and so on. I mean, that I'm just drawing on my knowledge, whatever my knowledge of textbooks is. In the primary school, you have a little more flexibility beyond the textbook. There is, I mean, you don't have to stick to the ICSE textbook. You can draw on various resources to teach. Not finding yourself in the content of the textbook. I think being of a minority, they are extremely careful not to sort of comment. Even in the Anglo-Indian forums where I was presenting my research, the Anglo-Indian Studies forums, it would be somebody like myself who was not from the community who would bring up this question of, this very parochial notion of nationalism and minority identities and so on. They are very careful not to comment on that. Not to suggest that when they talk about it, they'll say, well, we as Anglo-Indians, we can fit in anywhere. We are of a mixed race background, so there's no caste amongst Anglo-Indians. There's no casteism and there's no communalism. So we are not involved in those kinds of controversies and so on. I mean, since this last December, where we had these protests against celebration of Christmas, and I wonder now how the community will respond to those issues. Or being also there are I think two kinds of how do I put it, two kinds of benefits that Anglo-Indians can access. One is from within the Anglo-Indian Association, there are some scholarships. And as I said earlier, I mean, in the presentation, that through community leaders, they try to get jobs through community leaders and so on. And the Anglo-Indian schools are quite, it is their mandate to give employment to Anglo-Indians. But coming back to this point about national, they will often talk about their jobs as part of nation building. So I teach the children, because this is important for the nation for the nation, that you must learn. I teach them that you must learn to build up the nation, to contribute to your nation, that sort of thing. Also, I think that is part of the discourse of the Anglo-Indians who have remained in India, who have not migrated. They have very, very little patience with the diaspora, because they feel they've chosen to continue in India, which is, the more difficult decision to make, to build their lives in India rather than to migrate. I think the defining of the nation in a rigid manner, perhaps if I did the fieldwork again today amongst the community, not necessarily only amongst, because, as I said, there are fewer and fewer teachers, then perhaps there might be more, concern with that issue of how do you fit into a nation that is becoming so narrowly defined. I would probably hear more about that.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay.
Are there any other questions or comments regarding the talk today?
Yes, it's already 3:45. I guess.
Shall we conclude, ma'am, then? Anu, ma'am?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Okay, ma'am. So, so now we're moving towards the end of the talk. So now I would like to thank Dr. Jyothsna for presenting this talk on a very important topic, I would say, because as students of various social science disciplines, we're often encouraged to expand our vision as much as possible and to explore avenues in the society as much as we can in the very limited time that we have in the institute, and particularly pay attention to the interdisciplinary aspects of these areas. Now, the talk that you have delivered is a reflection of the interdisciplinary nature of the society, combining elements of various disciplines like gender studies, sociology, and education. And as one of my peers mentioned today, it has definitely expanded our vision to look into a dwindling community in our society, and has provided a very comprehensive look into their societal contributions and the field of education, and with the emphasis on their complex group dynamics, both from a historical and contemporary perspective, and that too in a pan-India level, not just you have been able to do that for us. And as you mentioned, in the current Indian climate, it is extremely important to look into narratives outside of the majoritarian perspective. And research is perhaps the most authentic way to do this. And that is exactly what we have received today, an authentic look into one minority narrative that is, within our country. So added to this, we've also gained insights into elements of qualitative research, how to conduct a successful qualitative research, particularly, like you mentioned, elements like thematic analysis in research and everything. So I'm sure for me, it has been a truly illuminating talk, and I'm sure for my peers as well. And on behalf of my peers, as well as the Institute, I would like to thank Dr. Jyothsna at this moment for taking time out of busy schedule, I imagine, and delivering this talk here today. I would like to, along with that, I would like to thank the faculty at TISS, St. Privety School of Education, for organizing this talk for us, to supplement whatever academic knowledge that we can get from the Institute. Along with that, I thank the administration who has set up this meeting, and all of my peers who have come to this talk, this discussion, and contributed to the discussion with their questions. And I thank them for participating, and all of my peers who have helped with organizing this meeting as well. So thank you. Thanks a lot. I would now hand over the meeting
to you as well. I'd like to thank all of you for attending. I would love to hear more feedback and critique. I think I would also like to learn from peers, and it's been a great pleasure to present my work to all the students and the professors at TISS. So thank you for inviting me as well.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you. I hand over the meeting to Anu ma'am now.
Yeah, technically I'm the host for the Zoom meeting. So thank you again, Jyothsna, and I'll end the session now. And the institute is reopening gradually. Hopefully we'll have you over at the campus.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jyothsna. Thank you very much.